Chapter 1. Arrival in Mulberry Hollow. The narrow winding road leading into Mulberry Hollow was framed by lush hedgerows and towering oaks, their leaves shimmering in the early autumn sunlight. Detective Jane Parsons, seated in a well-appointed carriage, gazed out at the bucolic landscape, a rare smile touching her lips. She had been looking forward to this respite from the bustling streets of London. Mulberry Hollow, a village so quaint it seemed untouched by time, promised the tranquility she so desperately needed. As the village came into view, as the carriage rounded a bend, revealing a cluster of thatched cottages nestled in the valley below, a church spire rose above the rooftops, and smoke curled lazily from the chimneys. Jane could almost hear the quiet murmur of village life, the blacksmith's hammer ringing in the forge, the laughter of children playing in the fields, the gentle clucking of hens in cottage gardens. It was a scene straight out of a pastoral painting, far removed from the grim realities of crime and corruption. Jane's arrival did not go unnoticed. As the carriage slowed to a stop outside the inn, a group of villagers gathered, their curiosity piqued by the sight of an unfamiliar face. A tall, slender woman with an air of quiet authority, Jane was not the sort of visitor the village often received. She stepped down from the carriage, her gaze sweeping over the assembled villagers, noting the mix of friendly smiles and cautious glances. "Good day," she greeted them with a nod, her voice carrying the crisp enunciation of someone well educated. "I'm Detective Jane Parsons, here for a brief holiday." Her announcement caused a stir. The word detective seemed to spark a flurry of excitement and concern among the onlookers. Jane was accustomed to such reactions. People were always intrigued by the presence of a detective in their midst, and sometimes they were nervous too. "Detective, you say?" A grizzled man in a flat cap stepped forward, his eyes narrowing with interest. "We don't get many of your sort out here in Mulberry Hollow." "No, I suppose not," Jane replied with a smile. "I'm here for a bit of peace and quiet. I hope your village can provide it." The man chuckled, a sound like gravel shifting underfoot. "Aye, that it can, but you might find we have our share of troubles too, Miss Parsons." Jane raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the remark. "Oh, I was under the impression Mulberry Hollow was a peaceful place." The man shrugged. "It is, mostly, but every village has its secrets." Before Jane could inquire further, the innkeeper, a stout woman with a welcoming smile, bustled out to greet her. "Miss Parsons, welcome to the Fox and Hound. I'm Mrs. Harding, the innkeeper. We've got your room ready, and I've made sure it's the quietest one in the house. Just what you need after a long journey, I'm sure." "Thank you, Mrs. Harding," Jane replied, accepting the warm welcome. She followed the innkeeper inside, leaving the curious villagers to disperse and return to their daily routines. The interior of the Fox and Hound was as charming as its exterior, with low-beamed ceilings, polished wood floors, and a roaring fire in the hearth. The scent of roasting meat and freshly baked bread wafted from the kitchen, making Jane realize just how hungry she was after the journey. Mrs. Harding led her up a narrow staircase to a cozy room overlooking the village green. The bed was covered in a patchwork quilt, and the window was flung open to let in the crisp autumn air. As Jane unpacked her few belongings, she couldn't help but reflect on the innkeeper's words. Every village has its secrets. It was true, of course. Even in the most idyllic of settings, human nature had a way of revealing its darker side. But she was here to rest, not to pry into the lives of the villagers. After freshening up, Jane decided to take a stroll through the village. The afternoon sun bathed Mulberry Hollow in a golden light, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. She walked past the church, its doors open to reveal a modest but well-kept interior, and continued on to the village green, where children played under the watchful eyes of their mothers. As she wandered, Jane was struck by the sense of timelessness that pervaded the village. It was as though Mulberry Hollow had been suspended in a bygone era, untouched by the rapid changes sweeping through the rest of the country. Her steps led her to the edge of the village, where a grand manor house stood on a slight rise, overlooking the fields and woods beyond. Thorncroft House, she recalled from the innkeeper's description. It was the home of Mr. Edwin Carter, the local squire. And Jane was lost in her thoughts for a few moments when the distant sound of church bells tolling broke the stillness. The solemn tone carried on the wind, and just as she was almost back at the inn, Mrs. Harding came rushing outside. Miss, haven't you heard?" she cried. "It's Mr. Carter. He's dead." Jane's heart skipped a beat. Her holiday had just taken a very different turn. Chapter 2. The Disgruntled Neighbour. Jane turned and walked back through the winding streets past the familiar cottages. Her mind was already racing, shifting from the relaxed state of a holidaymaker to the sharp focus of a detective. The news of Mr. Edwin Carter's death had sent a ripple of shock through the village, and she approached the Thorncroft Manor. She noticed a small crowd that had gathered near the front entrance, their faces etched with a mixture of horror and curiosity. Among them were a few villagers she had seen earlier in the square, now huddled together, whispering in hushed tones. The atmosphere was thick with unease, the kind that often accompanied sudden and unexplained death. Jane's arrival drew the attention of the local constable, a stout man with a ruddy complexion and a bristling moustache. He stepped forward to meet her, his expression a mix of relief and concern. "Detective Parsons, I'm glad you're here," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Constable Lewis. I'd heard you were in the village, but I never expected we'd be needing your services so soon." "Nor did I, Constable," Jane replied, shaking his hand firmly. "What can you tell me about the situation?" Lewis sighed, casting a glance back at the manor. "Mr. Edwin Carter, the squire of Thorncroft House, was found dead in his study not an hour ago. It was one of the servants who discovered him. She came in to bring him his evening tea and found him slumped over his desk. At first they thought it might be a natural death, but there are troubling signs." "Troubling signs?" Jane echoed, her interest piqued. "Yes," Lewis said, lowering his voice. "There's a broken teacup on the floor, and the room shows signs of a struggle. Mr. Carter has a wound on the back of his head, and there's blood on the corner of his desk. It doesn't look accidental." Jane nodded, her mind already assembling the pieces of the puzzle. "Has the scene been secured?" "As best as we could manage," Lewis replied. "I've kept everyone out of the study, but you know how it is in a village this small. News travels fast, and people are already starting to speculate." "Let's take a look then," Jane said, her tone resolute. Constable Lewis led her through the grand entrance of Thorncroft House. It was richly furnished, with heavy drapes, polished wood, and portraits of Carter ancestors lining the walls. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and aged paper, a library of history that had witnessed generations of the Carter family. They made their way down a long hallway towards the study. The constable paused before a heavy oak door. "In here," he said. "Take a look before the body is taken away by the coroner's office." The door creaked open to reveal a spacious study, lined with bookshelves, each packed with volumes that hinted at Mr. Carter's scholarly interests. A large mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, its surface cluttered with papers, an inkstand, and a quill. Behind the desk, in an ornate leather chair, sat the lifeless body of the squire. Mr. Carter was slumped forward, his head resting on the desk's edge, a pool of blood staining the dark wood beneath him. The broken teacup lay on the floor beside the chair, shards of porcelain scattered across the Persian rug. Careful not to disturb anything, Jane circled the desk, her keen eyes taking in every detail. The wound on Mr. Carter's head was deep, likely caused by a blunt object. There were no signs of forced entry, and the windows were securely closed. Whoever had committed this crime had either been let in by Mr. Carter or had gained access to the study unnoticed. She noticed something else. Mr. Carter's hand, partially hidden under his body, clutched a piece of paper. Gently, she pried it loose and unfolded it. It was a letter, written in a shaky hand, and as she read the first few lines, she realized it was a draft of a will. Her brow furrowed as she scanned the document. This could be a crucial clue, but it would require careful examination later. As she continued to survey the room, her gaze fell upon a small object on the floor near the fireplace. A silver cufflink, glinting in the fading light. She picked it up, inspecting the intricate design. It was finely crafted, bearing the initials H.G. "Constable Lewis," she called, her voice steady. "Take a look at this cufflink. Is there anyone in this household who would have the initials H.G.? Lewis studied the cufflink. "Not in this household, miss. Parsons, but there is a Mr. Harold Green in the village, and he had a well-known feud with Mr. Carter." They left Thorncroft House and made their way to Mr. Green's cottage, a stark contrast to the grandeur of Thorncroft House. Jane knocked on the door, and after a moment, the door creaked open to reveal Mr. Harold Green himself, a tall, thin man with a face deeply lined by age and bitterness. His grey hair was unkempt, and his clothes were worn but clean. He peered out at them with narrowed eyes, his expression one of suspicion and irritation. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice gruff. "Good evening, Mr. Green," Jane said calmly. "I'm Detective Jane Parsons, and this is Constable Lewis. We're here to ask you a few questions about Mr. Edwin Carter." Green's scowl deepened. "What about him? I heard he's dead. Good riddance, if you ask me." "That's precisely why we're here, Mr. Green," Jane replied, her tone unwavering. "Mr. Carter was found dead in his study under suspicious circumstances. We're investigating his death, and we understand you had a rather contentious relationship with him." Green snorted, crossing his arms over his chest. "Contentious? That's putting it mildly. That man was a menace, always trying to take what wasn't his, but that doesn't mean I had anything to do with his death." "Perhaps not," Jane said, studying his face for any sign of deception. "But we found something at the scene that may belong to you." She produced the silver cufflink, holding it up for Green to see. His eyes widened, and for a brief moment his composure faltered. Jane noticed the subtle twitch of his hand, the tightening of his jaw. "That's not mine," he said quickly, too quickly. "Are you sure, Mr. Green?" The constable interjected. "It bears the initials H.G., the same as yours." Green looked strangely at Jane. I don't know how it got there," he stammered. "I haven't been to Thorncroft House in weeks." "We'll need to verify your whereabouts at the time of Mr. Carter's death, Mr. Green. Can you tell us where you were earlier this evening?" Jane asked. Green hesitated, a bead of sweat forming on his brow. "I was here, at home, alone. I don't have anyone who can vouch for me." "I see," Jane said, looking straight at him. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Green. In the meantime, I suggest you stay available for further questioning." With that, she and Constable Lewis made their way back to the village. Mr. Harold Green was certainly hiding something, but whether it was guilt over a murder or simply fear of being wrongly accused, Jane couldn't yet be sure. The cufflink was a strong piece of evidence, but it was not definitive. She would need more to connect Green to the crime, or to rule him out entirely. As Jane returned to the Fox and Hound, the night had settled over Mulberry Hollow. She knew would need to uncover the village's secrets, one by one, to find the truth behind Mr. Carter's death. Chapter 3: The Scorned Lover. Jane woke up the next morning, her mind buzzing with the details, and after a quick breakfast in the inn's cozy dining room, she set out for her next destination, the home of Miss Emily Tisdale. The young woman, known to the villagers as Mr. Carter's recent paramour, had become the subject of much speculation following his death. Jane had already heard whispers about the tumultuous end to their relationship, and she was eager to hear Emily's side of the story. As she walked through the village, the cobblestones still damp with morning dew, she couldn't help but notice the watchful eyes of the villagers following her. Word of Mr. Carter's death had spread quickly, and the presence of a renowned detective in their midst had only fueled the gossip. Miss Emily Tisdale lived in a charming cottage at the edge of the village, its front garden a riot of colour from the late summer blooms. The cottage was modest, but well kept, with a thatched roof and ivy creeping up the stone walls. As Jane approached, she noticed a figure standing at the gate, staring out into the distance. It was Emily herself, a slender young woman with auburn hair that glinted in the sunlight. She was dressed in a simple yet elegant gown, her posture tense, as though she were waiting for something or someone. "Miss Tisdale," Jane called out as she neared the gate. Emily turned, her expression shifting from one of distant contemplation to wary curiosity. "Yes, I'm Emily Tisdale," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "You must be the detective I've heard about." Jane offered a polite smile. "Yes, may I have a word with you, Miss Tisdale?" Emily hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the cottage before she nodded. "Of course. Please come inside." Jane followed Emily through the gate and up the stone path to the cottage. Inside, the furnishings were simple but tasteful, a reflection of Emily's understated elegance. She led Jane to a small sitting room, where they took their seats on a pair of upholstered chairs, facing a low table adorned with a vase of fresh flowers. "Would you like some tea, Detective?" Emily offered, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a porcelain teapot. "No, thank you," Jane replied gently, noticing the nervousness in the young woman's movements. "I won't take up too much of your time, Miss Tisdale. I'm here to ask you a few questions about Mr. Edwin Carter." At the mention of his name, Emily's expression tightened, a flicker of pain crossing her features. "I heard about his death," she said quietly, her voice laced with sorrow. "It's a terrible thing. I can hardly believe it." "I understand that you were close to Mr. Carter," Jane began, her tone measured and careful. "I've also heard that your relationship ended recently. Can you tell me about that?" Emily's eyes dropped to her lap, where she twisted a handkerchief between her fingers. "Yes, we were close. For a time. But things changed. Edwin, he was a complicated man. At first, I thought he truly cared for me, but in the end, I realized that he was more interested in control than in love." "Control?" Jane prompted, her interest piqued. Emily nodded, a trace of bitterness creeping into her voice. "He wanted to dictate every aspect of my life, who I could see, what I could do. He even tried to influence my family. When I resisted, he became distant, cold, and then out of the blue he told me it was over, that he had found someone else, someone more suitable to his station." Jane studied Emily closely, noting the mix of emotions that played across her face: hurt, anger, and perhaps a lingering affection. "Do you know who this other person was?" Emily shook her head. "No, he never mentioned a name, but there were rumours. People in the village said he was seeing a woman from London, someone with connections. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew it was true." "And how did you feel about the end of your relationship?" Jane asked, leaning forward slightly. For a moment, Emily's composure faltered, and she blinked back tears. "I was devastated," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought we would be together. But when he cast me aside so easily, I realized how little I truly meant to him. It hurt, Detective. It hurt more than I can put into words." Jane let the silence hang for a moment, allowing Emily to collect herself. "Did you ever confront Mr. Carter after he ended the relationship?" Emily looked up, her eyes flashing with a mix of defiance and regret. "Yes, I did. I went to see him a few days ago. I wanted to know why he had treated me so cruelly, but he wouldn't even see me. He sent a servant to turn me away, like I was nothing more than a common beggar." "Where were you yesterday evening, Miss Tisdale?" Jane asked, her tone gentle but probing. "I was at home," Emily replied, her voice steadier now. "I didn't leave the cottage. I was trying to put everything behind me, trying to move on. I had no reason to see Edwin again, not after the way he treated me." Jane considered her words, weighing the sincerity of Emily's emotions, against the possibility of deception. The young woman's pain seemed genuine, but Jane knew that heartbreak could sometimes lead to darker impulses. "Is there anyone who can confirm your whereabouts?" Jane asked. Emily shook her head. "No, I was alone. My mother is visiting relatives in Bath, and I haven't had any visitors since everything ended with Edwin." Jane nodded, her mind racing as she processed the information. Emily Tisdale was clearly a woman scorned, someone who had suffered deeply at the hands of Mr. Carter. But was that enough to drive her to murder? "Thank you for your honesty, Miss Tisdale," Jane said, rising from her chair. "I may need to speak with you again as the investigation progresses. In the meantime, if you think of anything else that might be relevant, please don't hesitate to contact me." Emily stood as well, her expression weary but grateful. "I will, Detective. And thank you. I just want to put all of this behind me." As Jane left the cottage and made her way back to the village, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Emily Tisdale's story. The young woman's emotions had been raw, her pain palpable, but pain could be a powerful motivator, especially when coupled with a sense of betrayal. Jane had two suspects now, each with a potential motive, but neither with solid evidence linking them directly to the crime. And then there was the matter of the mysterious woman from London, the supposed new love interest of Mr. Carter. Jane would need to delve deeper into the squire's life to uncover any connections that might lead her closer to the truth. Back to the Fox and Hound, Jane decided to speak with Mrs. Harding once more to see who else was closely connected to the deceased. She realized she would need to speak with Charles Carter, Mr. Edwin Carter's nephew, and the heir to Thorncroft House. Village gossip had it that Charles had ambitions of his own and often did not see eye to eye with his uncle. Chapter 4. The Ambitious Nephew. After talking to Mrs. Harding, Jane made her way to the Thorncroft House. Charles Carter had been the subject of much speculation in the village. The young man, in his late 20s, was known for his charm, good looks, and a reputation for ambition that some found unsettling. Though he had only recently returned from London to stay with his uncle, it was clear to many that Charles had his eyes set on the Thorncroft estate, and Edwin's sudden death had only heightened the villagers' interest in his motives. As she approached the grand manor once more, she took a moment to study the grounds, the neatly trimmed hedges, the well-maintained flower beds, and the orderly rows of trees all spoke of wealth and tradition, and sometimes, where there was wealth, there was greed. The housekeeper, Mrs. Whitby, met Jane at the door, her face lined with concern and weariness. "I am here to meet with Mr. Charles Carter." Mrs. Whitby returned to the door with a strained smile. "Mr. Charles in the study, and you may see him now." "Thank you, Mrs. Whitby," Jane replied, noting the woman's nervous demeanour. Mrs. Whitby nodded and led Jane through the familiar corridors of the manor to the study where Edwin Carter had met his end. Charles Carter was seated behind the same mahogany desk where his uncle's lifeless body had been found. He looked every bit the part of a gentleman, with his neatly tailored suit, dark hair combed back with precision, and a composed, almost aloof expression. Yet there was something in his eyes, an intensity that Jane immediately picked up on. Whether it was grief, ambition, or something more dangerous, she couldn't yet tell. "Detective Parsons," Charles greeted her with a nod, his voice calm and measured. "Thank you for coming. I understand you have some questions for me." "Yes, I do," Jane replied, taking a seat across from him. "I appreciate your cooperation during what must be a difficult time for you." Charles leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped in front of him. "Difficult, yes, but necessary. My uncle's death was a shock to us all, and I'm as eager as anyone to understand what happened." Jane studied him for a moment, noting the ease with which he spoke about his uncle's death. There was no sign of grief, or even sadness, just a cold determination to address the matter at hand. "Can you tell me about your relationship with your uncle?" Jane asked, her tone probing but not accusatory. "From what I've gathered, you only recently returned to Mulberry Hollow." Charles nodded, his expression neutral. "That's correct. I've been living in London for the past several years, pursuing various business ventures. My uncle and I were never particularly close, but we maintained a cordial relationship. He invited me to stay at Thorncroft House while I considered my future, and I accepted. I've only been here for a few weeks." Jane nodded, her pen poised to take notes. "And how did you find your uncle during that time? Did you notice anything unusual in his behavior?" Charles considered the question for a moment, his gaze drifting to the window, as if recalling the last few weeks. "My uncle was always a reserved man, but I did sense that something was troubling him. He was preoccupied, distant even. I attributed it to the pressures of managing the estate, but now, I wonder if there was something more." "Did he confide in you at all?" Jane asked, watching his reaction closely. Charles shook his head. "No, not in any meaningful way. We spoke of business matters, the estate, and my plans for the future, but he never shared anything personal. I got the sense that he preferred to keep his thoughts to himself." "What about your future plans?" Jane asked, steering the conversation toward the topic that most intrigued her. "It's no secret that you are the heir to Thorncroft House. Did you and your uncle discuss what would happen when he passed?" Charles's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he detected the subtle implication in her question. "My uncle made it clear that I would inherit the estate in due course, but we did not dwell on the subject. I was more focused on my ventures in London, to be honest. Thorncroft House is a fine estate, but it was never my primary concern." Jane could sense a hint of defensiveness in his tone, though he quickly masked it with a practiced calm. "And yet, with your uncle's sudden death, you find yourself in a position of responsibility much sooner than expected." "Yes," Charles replied, his voice clipped. "It is not a situation I sought, but it is one I must now manage. The estate needs to be maintained, the tenants reassured. I have a duty to uphold my family's legacy, Detective." "Do you know of anyone who might have wished your uncle harm?" Jane asked, changing tack slightly. "He was a man of some influence in the village. Perhaps there were others who resented him." Charles frowned, his expression thoughtful. "My uncle was not a man to make enemies lightly, but I suppose there were a few who might have held grudges. Harold Green, for one. Their feud over land boundaries was well known. And then there was Emily Tisdale." Jane leaned forward slightly, her interest piqued. "What about Miss Tisdale?" Charles hesitated, his gaze dropping to the desk before he continued. "She was involved with my uncle, but their relationship ended badly. She came to see him a few days ago, causing a scene. I happened to be passing by the study and overheard some of what was said. She was angry, upset. I don't think she ever forgave him for casting her aside." "And where were you at the time of your uncle's death, Mr. Carter?" Jane asked, her tone turning serious. Charles met her gaze squarely, his expression unreadable. "I was in my room, going over some business papers. I heard the commotion when the servant discovered my uncle's body, but by then it was too late. I went to the study, saw what had happened, and called for the constable immediately." "Can anyone corroborate that?" Jane asked. Charles's jaw tightened. "No, I was alone. I didn't think I would need an alibi, Detective. I had no reason to harm my uncle." Jane let the silence stretch out, allowing Charles to feel the weight of her scrutiny. He held her gaze, his expression unwavering, but Jane could sense the tension simmering just beneath the surface. "Mr. Carter," she said finally, her voice measured, "I appreciate your cooperation, but I must ask you to remain available for further questioning." "Of course," Charles replied, though there was a hint of irritation in his tone. "I have nothing to hide, Detective. I want the truth to come out as much as you do." Jane stood pocketing her notebook. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Carter. I'll see myself out." As she left the study and made her way through the grand halls of Thorncroft House, Jane's mind was awash with thoughts. Charles Carter had presented himself as a man of duty, burdened by responsibility, but there was an undercurrent of something darker, ambition perhaps, or resentment. He had much to gain from his uncle's death, but without concrete evidence, Jane could only speculate. As she walked back to the Fox and Hound, she decided to dig deeper into Charles Carter's background. His time in London, his business ventures, anything that might shed light on his character and motivations. And then there was the matter of the mysterious woman from London, the rumoured new love interest of Edwin Carter. If she existed, Jane would need to find her. The truth was out there, hidden among the lies and secrets of Mulberry Hollow. Chapter 5: Secrets of the Estate. As she walked through the village, Jane noticed the curious glances from the locals, and she couldn't help but feel that the villagers were holding back, as if they knew more than they were letting on. After her walk, she decided to head back to the Fox and Hound and settled into the cosy sitting room with a pot of tea and her notebook. She reviewed her notes, tracing the connections between the three main suspects: Harold Green, Emily Tisdale, and Charles Carter. Each had a potential motive, but none of them had a solid alibi. As Jane pondered her next move, the inn's proprietor, Mrs. Havisham, entered the room with a sympathetic smile. The elderly woman had a kind face, framed by a halo of white curls, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had seen it all. "Detective Parsons," Mrs. Havisham said warmly, "you look deep in thought. Is there anything I can do to assist you?" Jane looked up from her notes, grateful for the interruption. "Thank you, Mrs. Havisham. What can you tell me about the squire?" Mrs. Havisham took a seat across from Jane. Edwin Carter was a complicated man. He had his share of enemies, that's for certain, but he was also a man of many secrets. Thorncroft House has been in the Carter family for generations, and there are stories. Well, let's just say that not everything that happens there is known to the public. Jane's interest was piqued. "What do you mean by that? Are there rumours about the estate?" Mrs. Havisham leaned in slightly, her voice lowering as if she were about to share a great secret. "There have been whispers for years, Detective. Stories of hidden rooms, secret passages, and even buried treasures. Some say that the Carters have always been a bit eccentric. There was talk of Edwin's father, Reginald Carter, dabbling in the occult. And then there's the matter of the family's finances. Thorncroft House is grand, yes, but it takes a fortune to maintain a place like that. There were rumours that the family was on the brink of financial ruin." Jane absorbed this information, her mind racing with possibilities, wondering if those financial troubles could have played a role in Edwin's death. Charles Carter may be set to inherit the estate, but if there's nothing left to inherit, well, that could be a motive, couldn't it? Her thoughts returned to the conversation she had had with Charles. He had mentioned his uncle being preoccupied, possibly troubled by something. If the family was indeed facing financial difficulties, it could explain why Edwin had been so distant in the weeks leading up to his death. "Thank you, Mrs. Havisham," Jane said, standing up. "You've given me a lot to think about. I need to look into the Carter family's history more closely, and perhaps even pay another visit to Thorncroft House." Mrs. Havisham smiled, her eyes twinkling with a mix of curiosity and concern. "You be careful, Detective. Mulberry Hollow may seem like a peaceful village, but there's more beneath the surface than meets the eye." With renewed determination, Jane left the Fox and Hound and headed for the village archives. Mulberry Hollow was an old village, steeped in history, and Jane was certain that the archives would hold valuable information about the Carter family and Thorncroft House. The archives were housed in an old stone building near the centre of the village, a place that smelled of aged paper and dust. Jane was greeted by the village librarian, Mr. Prentice, a bespectacled man with a passion for history. "Detective Parsons," Mr. Prentice said with a smile, "what brings you to our humble archives?" "I'm looking into the history of the Carter family," Jane replied, "specifically Thorncroft House. I'm hoping you might have some records that could shed light on the family's background." Mr. Prentice nodded eagerly. "Ah, the Carters. A fascinating family, to be sure. We have several records on them. deeds, wills, old letters, and even some newspaper clippings. Follow me and I'll show you where to start. Jane followed Mr. Prentice to a back room filled with shelves of old documents. He pulled out a large leather-bound ledger and laid it on the table before her. "This is the Carter family ledger," he explained. "It contains records dating back to the 1700s. You'll find everything from property transactions to personal correspondence. Take your time. There's quite a bit to go through." Jane spent the next few hours poring over the ledger, her pen scratching across the pages of her notebook as she took notes. The records painted a picture of a family that had once been prosperous but had fallen on hard times in recent decades. The Carters had sold off parcels of land, one by one, to cover debts. There were references to loans, unpaid bills, and even a failed investment in a shipping venture. But it wasn't just the financial troubles that caught Jane's attention. There were also entries that hinted at internal family strife, arguments over inheritance, bitter disputes over the management of the estate, and a falling out between Reginald Carter and his brother. The ledger suggested that the Carter family had a history of secrets, some of which might have been buried along with their dead. As Jane delved deeper, she found references to a series of mysterious events that had taken place at Thorncroft House over the years. There were mentions of unexplained disappearances, strange noises in the night, and sightings of ghostly figures. One entry, in particular, caught Jane's eye. A note from Reginald Carter dated 1878, warning his descendants to stay away from a certain room in the east wing of the house. The east wing. Jane made a mental note to investigate that part of Thorncroft House on her next visit. If there was indeed a hidden room, it might hold clues to Edwin Carter's death, or even reveal a long-buried family secret. The Carter family's history was dark and troubled, and it was clear that Edwin's death was not just a random act of violence. Jane thanked Mr. Prentice for his help and left the archives with her notebook full of new leads. She knew that her next step was to confront Charles Carter with the information she had gathered. If there were financial troubles, he might know more than he was letting on. And if there was indeed a hidden room in the east wing of Thorncroft House, it was time to find out what secrets it held. Chapter 6. The Hidden Chamber. The wind whistled through the ancient oaks as Jane Parsons made her way up the winding path to Thorncroft House. The more she uncovered about the Carter family, the more she realized that this case was anything but straightforward. Thorncroft House was steeped in history, and its walls held stories that no one wanted to tell. When Jane reached the grand entrance, she was greeted by Mrs. Whitby, the housekeeper. The older woman's eyes were wary, as if she sensed that the detective's visit would stir up things best left undisturbed. "Detective Parsons," Mrs. Whitby said with a curt nod. "Mr. Carter is in the drawing room. Shall I fetch him for you?" "Thank you, Mrs. Whitby," Jane replied, her voice calm but firm. "But before I speak with Mr. Carter, I'd like to take a look at the east wing of the house. There are some matters that need further investigation." Mrs. Whitby hesitated, her hand tightening around the edge of her apron. "The east wing, Detective. It's not been used in years. I'm not sure what you'll find there." "Perhaps nothing," Jane said, her eyes meeting the housekeeper's. "But I need to be thorough. Can you show me the way?" Reluctantly, Mrs. Whitby nodded and led Jane through the dimly lit corridors of the manor. As they walked, Jane couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the well-maintained areas of the house and the parts that had been left to decay. The east wing, in particular, felt neglected, with dust gathering in the corners and the air heavy with the scent of old wood and damp. This part of the house was closed off years ago after Mr. Reginald's death, Mrs. Whitby explained as they approached a heavy oak door. "No one has had reason to go in there since. Mr. Edwin preferred to keep it locked." Jane's pulse quickened as Mrs. Whitby produced a large iron key and inserted it into the door's rusty lock. The door creaked open with a groan, revealing a long hallway shrouded in darkness. The air inside was musty, as if it had not been disturbed in decades. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitby," Jane said, taking a lantern from the housekeeper. "I'll manage from here." Mrs. Whitby hesitated, her gaze lingering on Jane, as if she wanted to say something more, but then she simply nodded and turned to leave. Jane watched her retreating figure for a moment before stepping into the hallway, the lantern casting flickering shadows on the walls. The east wing was a relic of a bygone era. The walls were lined with faded tapestries, depicting hunting scenes and family portraits, their colors muted by time. Jane moved cautiously, examining each door she passed, opening them to reveal rooms filled with dusty furniture and cobweb-covered corners. There was no sign of recent activity, yet Jane's instincts told her that something was amiss. She continued down the corridor until she reached the end, where a large, ornately carved door stood slightly ajar. She pushed the door open, revealing what appeared to be a study or library. The room was small, with shelves lined with old books and a large desk dominating the center. The desk was covered in papers, some yellowed with age, others more recent. As she approached the desk, she noticed a peculiar smell in the air. A faint scent of earth and something else, something metallic. Her eyes scanned the papers on the desk. Most were financial records and letters, but one document in particular caught her attention. It was a handwritten note, dated 1878, the same year Reginald Carter had warned his descendants to avoid the East Wing. The note was brief, but its contents sent a chill down Jane's spine. The key to the Carter legacy lies beneath the floorboards. Only those of true blood may claim it. Beware, for the path is fraught with peril, and the price of greed is death. She knelt down beside the desk and began examining the floor. The wooden boards were worn with age, but one section, near the far corner of the room, appeared slightly different. The wood was newer, as if it had been replaced at some point. Jane ran her fingers over the boards, feeling for any irregularities. Her heart skipped a beat when she felt a slight give beneath her touch. With a sense of urgency, Jane pried at the loose floorboard, using a letter opener she found on the desk. The board came up with a creak, revealing a small, hollow space beneath. Inside, she found a small, ornate box, its surface engraved with intricate patterns that matched those on the door. She placed the box on the desk and examined it more closely. There was no visible lock, but the lid was sealed shut, as if it had not been opened in years. Taking a deep breath, Jane applied gentle pressure to the lid, and after a moment it began to give way. The lid creaked open, revealing the contents within, a collection of old coins, a few pieces of jewelry, and a small, leather-bound journal. Jane's eyes were immediately drawn to the journal. It was worn and fragile, the pages yellowed with age. She opened it carefully, revealing neat, handwritten entries. The first page was dated March 14th, 1878, the same year as Reginald Carter's note. Jane began reading through the journal, the entries detailed. Reginald Carter's obsession with the family's financial troubles and his desperate attempts to preserve the Carter legacy. But it was the final entry that intrigued her. March 30th, 1878. The ritual is complete. The treasure is secured, but the cost is too great. The curse has been set in motion. Only blood can break it. May my descendants forgive me for what I have done. This burden is theirs now. Jane's mind raced as she processed the implications of what she had just read. A ritual, a curse, and a hidden treasure. These were not the ramblings of a madman, but the final words of a desperate man who believed he had damned his family. The journal, the hidden box, the note, all of it pointed to something far darker and more sinister than she had imagined. Before she could fully absorb the gravity of her discovery, she heard a faint creak behind her. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned to see the door to the room slowly swinging shut. She wasn't alone. Reacting quickly, she grabbed the journal and the small box, shoving them into her coat pocket as she moved toward the door. But just as she reached it, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the room. Her hand shot out to grab the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She was locked in. Taking a deep breath, she stepped back from the door and scanned the room for another way out. Her eyes landed on a narrow window near the ceiling, barely large enough for someone to squeeze through. With no other options, she grabbed a chair and climbed up to the window, prying it open with some effort. She hoisted herself up, struggling to fit through the narrow opening, and felt the scrape of the rough stone against her skin as she wriggled her way out, dropping down into the overgrown garden outside. Breathing heavily, Jane took a moment to steady herself. She had the journal, and she had the box, evidence that something far more sinister was at play in Thorncroft House. But who had locked her in? Was it Charles, trying to cover his tracks? Or someone else, someone who knew about the hidden chamber and wanted to keep its secrets buried? As she made her way back to the main part of the house, Jane's mind raced with possibilities. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but there were still too many unanswered questions. What had Edwin Carter known? Had he discovered the hidden chamber before his death, or had someone else found it and killed him to keep the secret?